Good afternoon, everyone, and another time of the day, if that's what's the case, wherever you're tuning in from. My name's Gordon Porter. I'm the Director of Inclusive Education Canada, and I want to welcome you to this webinar sponsored by Inclusive Education Canada. Our mandate and vision is to make Canadian schools inclusive. We try to share relevant information on topics and interests of teachers, school leaders, parents, and families. We do our work through contributions by members of our network of associates and others, and we appreciate their partnership. This webinar is one of IEC's series of projects. You may know about our Let's Chat about inclusive education sessions, 30-minute chats with individuals actively advancing inclusive education in Canada. They're located on our website. We'll soon launch a series of Let's Chat sessions in French, developed in cooperation with several of our Francophone associates and focused on the work of Francophone educators in several Canadian provinces. Now today, first, I want to acknowledge that Dr. Tim Warman, President of Concordia University of Edmonton, Alberta, is unable to join us as the moderator of this session for personal reasons, and we wish him and his family well. Now, let's focus on today's topic, special schools and their connection to advancing inclusion in mainstream schools. Special schools for children with intellectual disabilities was one of the founding mandates of what is now Inclusion Canada. And of course, Inclusive Education Canada is a project and an initiative of Inclusion Canada. But since the 1950s, when that effort started to ensure equity and inclusion in public education, most special schools have been closed in Canada, but not all. In a number of provinces and communities, the special school model lives on, typically operated by local public education authorities or school districts. Special schools, and I might add special classes and inclusion, can they coexist in our public education system and deliver the quality that our children deserve? Are there tensions that need to be addressed? At this point, I'd like to introduce, first of all, I will introduce our panel soon, but first I want to welcome Professor Mann, our special guest today, to our webinar, and we'll ask her to provide an overview of her work. Glenys Mann is a senior lecturer and researcher at the Centre for Inclusive Education at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. Dr. Mann and her research team reviewed the special school closure process in Canada. They critically reviewed the Canadian literature and developed a conceptual framework of drivers for and barriers to special school closure. We've made the journal article that they wrote available, and I trust many of you have had the opportunity to read it. Please note that you can post questions and comments through the chat function of Zoom, and we will get to as many of them as we can. But with that, let me turn things over to Professor Mann and ask her to share the information that she's gleaned about special school closure in Canada and the implications for that in her country. Professor Mann, welcome.
Okay, thank you, Gordon, and hello to everybody out there. Hello from a lovely Queensland morning. It's 7 o'clock in the morning here, and it's a beautiful day with the blue sky out there, not too hot, so lovely to be here. And I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where QUT stands, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and also their customs, laws, and creation spirits. So I want to acknowledge that QUT stands on lands that have always been places of learning, and also acknowledge the valuable role that our First Nations people play in the QUT community. So I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit of background around why we decided to undertake this investigation. So the team of researchers that I work with here at QUT are members, as Gordon said, of the Centre for Inclusive Education. And so I'm very fortunate to be working with Suzanne Carrington, Carly Lassig, Sophia Mavropoulou, Beth Saggers, Kalula Killingley, and also Shirley Poet, who now works at the University of Queensland. So we are, all of us as researchers, really interested in progressing inclusion in schools, and particularly for students with disability. So the impetus for the paper that I'll talk a little bit about today was our conclusion that if we want to see inclusive education progress, it's no longer enough to just focus on making mainstream classes more inclusive. So this is, of course, a very important focus, and I'm not suggesting by any means that we shouldn't continue that focus, but we must also direct our energy towards closing special schools and moving towards a unified education system that accommodates all children. We came to that conclusion for a number of reasons. One of these is that the literature is full of research, ideas, reports, understandings about how to implement inclusion in schools. And we also have increasing inclusive education policies and expectations here in Australia. And yet, not only are special schools not closing as a result of all of this knowledge, their numbers are actually increasing. We also have continued reports of inconsistency in the application of inclusion in mainstream schools. So it's clear that just building capacity in mainstream schools will not naturally lead to a fading away of special schools, as I think many people hoped would happen. I think it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this, but I think it's been quite typical for people to feel that, we'll just leave these two systems to coexist, and once regular schools are ready, special schools will fade away and we won't need them anymore. Well, the evidence is not suggesting that. It's been quite a number of years now that inclusive strategies have been introduced more and more into our mainstream schools, and yet we're not seeing, at least here in Australia, we're not seeing a decrease in special schools. So we would argue that special schools cannot exist benignly alongside inclusive education reforms. They're actually a barrier to progressing inclusive education. So it's interesting to note, given that there's very little written in the literature about how to go about closing special schools. There's a lot of information about building capacity in regular schools, but not very much about how do we actually go about closing special schools. So we as a team decided we would explore that issue and find out more about it. We've actually undertaken a number of pieces of work with this focus. So we've written about the gap between inclusive education policy and practice here in Australia. We've investigated recent reviews into education for students with disability here in Australia, and so there have been quite a number of those. We wanted to see if there's any appetite in those reviews. So were there any conclusions or recommendations drawn in those reviews about closing special schools as a way to progress inclusive education? We also looked in those reviews about whether there's any commitment to redeploying funding to support that move to a unified system. And we found there was none. And we've also investigated public discourse here in Queensland about special school closures. So we've undertaken a number of bits of work in this area. But most importantly, we really wanted to see if we could learn from other people. We really wanted to look at jurisdictions outside Australia to see, particularly, obviously, those places around the world where there has been movement happening towards a unified system and the closure of special schools. We wanted to look around out there, investigate what other places are doing, and see if we can learn any lessons from that. So for us here in Australia, but not just us, for anybody really, any country that wants to really implement their obligations under the CRPD and General Comment Number 4 to move progressively away from a binary system. So hopefully we can contribute to a broader conversation, not just what's happening here in Queensland and in Australia. So when we thought about where would we look, naturally, first to mind was Canada, which has an international reputation and has had for some time for progress being made in inclusive education. Just on a bit of a tangent, quite a few years ago now, I think it was around 2017, I was lucky enough to go to a symposium that was held by Family Advocacy down in Sydney, here in Australia, around progressing inclusive education with a focus on desegregation. And one of their invited speakers was Jodie Carr. So it was very inspiring to hear him talk about the process that was undertaken there around that moving towards a unified system. So international reputation for progress towards inclusive education, and certainly progress, at least in New Brunswick, towards closing special schools. And I know other jurisdictions in Canada as well have done this. So we wanted to investigate the literature from Canada to see if we could learn some lessons from Europe, from the Canadian experience. And so although we originally intended to look for factors that seemed to drive and facilitate special school closure, that was our original intention, what could we read in the literature that gave us clues about, you know, the factors? What were the sparks there that made, that started the movement, that got things going? Really interested to see what that might be in case we could replicate some of those things. But it also became apparent as we looked through the literature that progress in Canada has been inconsistent. So in the various educational systems in different provinces, special school closure has happened at different rates. And as Gordon was saying earlier, of course, there are still areas where special schools exist. So that in itself, I think, is a really interesting situation to investigate. And of course, it does align very much with Australia, because here in Australia, we also have a number of states where decisions about education are made by the state bodies as opposed to a national body. So I think that was particularly interesting to us. So I think the lessons that we could also learn about what might be hindering or what might be barriers to special school closure in some of those provinces was also really important information, I think, for us to find out about. So we had an opportunity to learn about both the drivers and the barriers for a unified system regarding moving towards a unified system where all students are welcome and successful. So that's a little bit about the background about why we decided to do this work and why we chose to look at Canada. So we did actually we are looking at other countries as well and have written about that, but today we're just focusing on Canada. So Gordon, I'm just wondering whether you wanted to, like at this stage, whether you wanted to introduce the rest of the panel before we go on to those other questions, or shall I just continue?
Are you planning to use your PowerPoints to just share the basis of your analysis?
Yes. So I can do that now, or I thought you might want to introduce others, or?
Yeah, why don't you do that first, and then we'll get the others involved.
Okay. When we looked at the literature about what was happening in Canada, it became quite clear that dynamics for change were happening at different levels. So when we pulled all of the factors that we could find across the various documents, when we looked at the various factors, we could see that they were falling into 4 different levels. four different systems, I suppose, where change was being influenced. So one of these was the societal level. So in that, we could see dynamics for change around those bigger picture factors, attitudes, changes in beliefs, frameworks that operated at a societal level, which underpinned progress towards closing special schools. So we could see dynamics for change at that big overarching level. We could also see dynamics for change at the systems level. And by that, I mean education systems. So the bureaucratic level. What was happening around the structures that education systems were putting into place that was actually supporting or was a barrier to moving towards closing special schools. The third level of change was at the school level, so the grassroots level. What was happening in schools that was actually facilitating or acting as a barrier to a movement towards a unified system and a closure of that binary system and special schools. And finally, we could also see commentary, reporting on activity and action that happened at the community level. So at that level, we were thinking about parents, other organisations that were actually undertaking actions that promoted change. So we could see these four very distinct levels. People didn't write specifically about that, but as we looked at the factors, we could see they fell into those different levels of change. Now, we're not suggesting that those levels are that there's a linear movement between one. So we're not suggesting that change had to happen at that societal level before it moved down to a systems level, before it moved to a school level, before it moved down to a community level. We could see that all of these levels were quite interlinked with each other in quite diverse and dynamic ways. So there were actions and factors that were operating in all of those levels sort of simultaneously that seemed to be having an influence on other levels. I'll go through each of these levels a little bit more now. So at the societal level, some of the factors that we could identify that were written about regarding moving towards closing special schools were very much around, I've just pulled a few out here. So if you've had a chance to read the article, you'll be able to see all of them. I've pulled out some that I think seem to be quite key at this level. And one of them was whenever we read about closing special schools, there was always a conversation about social justice, human rights. So that movement in attitudes towards the way people with disability were viewed, that seemed to be a key underpinning factor at that societal level that changed people's minds, I suppose, that changed the way people viewed how students with disability could be serviced well in the education system. So that overarching change in attitudes, beliefs, values was really clear in the literature. A second factor that was very clear was that there was clear legislation for a unified education system. People referred to life-changing laws where it was no longer acceptable. It was no longer it became a legal obligation to include students with disabilities in mainstream classrooms. And so this was a big factor in the move away from special schools. A third key dynamic was the development of really clear inclusive education policies where it was no longer could be disputed what was meant by inclusive education. The policies were very clear that it was expected that students learn alongside their peers who didn't have a disability and that schools be supported in order to do that. So inclusive education policies really underpinned what was happening in schools. And I think another factor that was quite clear is the fourth one there. There was a sense of political and judicial leadership around moving to a binary system. So I'll come back to that notion of leadership a bit later, but this was certainly very clear at that societal level. There was leadership for change. leadership that showed commitment to doing something different and moving towards a unified system, recognizing, you know, the value and the social justice issues around a system for all. So working in tandem with these almost, so a bit of the tensions that Gordon referred to before, some of the tensions that were clear when we were reading through the literature was that there were definitely policy and action contradictions. So policies could be very clear, terminology could be clear, philosophy could be very clear about what was expected, but this did not always align with the action that was taking place. And in some of the cases, this action actually occurred at that societal level. So there were reports of legal cases being brought before the court around from families around being excluded from classrooms, and those legal cases led to endorsement of segregated practices. So there was an inconsistency with what was being promoted at that societal level, but then also different decisions that were being made that contradicted those that philosophy. I think the other thing that a lot of writers spoke about, and again, as I said, it's quite similar here in Australia. It's quite consistent across the literature from Canadian writers that there was a lack of the national policy, that because each province was making their decisions about their educational provision, there's an inconsistency there. So a lack of national policy around inclusive education was working as a barrier to that change to a unified system. So at the next level, at the systems level, so remember this is the level, the bureaucracy, what's happening in the education systems that we could discern from the literature. So a key driver that was evident in the literature is that in education systems, there was a change towards seeing inclusive education as the norm, as a default position. So not just something that maybe some families argued for, but the expectation that all children would be enrolled in their mainstream local schools. So it became the default position. You could read how that that approach sort of underpinned these changes to moving away from special schools. The second really key factor seemed to be that disability was no longer equated with special systems. It wasn't equated anymore with a special school. Disability wasn't equated anymore with special teachers alone. Disability wasn't equated with special resources. Disability, the view of disability, evolved to be incorporated and encompassed in a view of diversity, that schools had diverse classes and disability was part of that diversity. So it wasn't something that needed to be responded to in a special way. It was part of how we respond to diverse classes. The third extensive conversation really in the literature was around the structures, and of course the practical side of this is very important. It's not just around the philosophy. And we could read and discern in there reference to flexible bureaucratic structures. So instead of being rigid, instead of going about the business of structuring the system as it always had been done, there was lots of moves to change the way the education system was structured so that it could be more flexible, so that it could accommodate diversity and accommodated what needed to be done to support all students. The fourth strong message, and this comes out really across a lot of the systems, is a sense of collaboration, that this is a very big move, moving towards a special, moving away from special school systems and moving towards a unified system. It's a very big move. It can't be done by any one area alone. So collaboration is really important. So involving everybody that's involved in this, in the work towards that move. So the sense of collaboration and intentional collaboration, I think, was evident. The leaders in the systems were quite intentional about collaborating with stakeholders and making sure people were all contributing to what happened in that change. The last point there is around accountability. So you could read in the literature around the number of reviews that took place over the years when the change was happening, reviews to investigate how the changes were evolving, how were things going, evaluating the process and keeping the system accountable for actually moving forward and making the changes that were necessary. So in tension with all of those factors that were driving the closure of special schools, there were some forces that seemed to be working against it. And understandably, as we've just said, the complexity of moving to a unified system meant that operationalizing desegregation was quite difficult. A number of writers wrote about that. It was actually quite hard to disassemble the structures that were supporting the binary system. So that is a factor that was actually working against all of those drivers towards closing special schools. And as part of that, really, one of the key areas of concern is the issue of funding. How does one go about changing the funding structures that have existed supporting students? So again, disassembling the way that those funding processes operated and then rebuilding them to support inclusive practice. So moving away from supporting special schools, how are students funded in an inclusive way in mainstream schools? So these were some of the areas that are the tensions at that systemic level, the systemic considerations. Now, at a schools level, and I'll start by saying that this was a hard level really to bring ideas together, because we had to think really at that schools level, how do you tease out what's happening at a school level that's driving the closure of special schools, as opposed to is what is happening in the school level a product of changes around closing special schools. So whether what's happening is a driver or a product, it's really quite hard to tease out there. Nevertheless, these are some of the factors that we could see that were really important at that school's level around this move towards a unified system. The first one on the right there, and you see this again, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, that inclusive school leaders were really important. Many people wrote about how important it was to have leaders for equity and inclusion. So the role that leaders play in schools is quite critical to this movement to a unified system. The other dynamic that I think has come out quite regularly in the literature is innovation in teaching practices, because of course, if we're going to transform systems, we can't be doing what we've always done. We have to think about different ways that we go about supporting students in this mainstream environment. So skill building and support for teachers is really evident when we see a commitment to closing special schools. So alongside that commitment is a commitment to supporting teachers and really encouraging innovative practices, encouraging creative practice, so that the changes that we need to see in mainstream schools can continue to evolve. But not just for the mainstream teachers. There was also literature there, really interesting literature about how special education teachers were part of this move. So instead of working in sort of specialist segregated ways, special education teachers were redeployed to actually support the work of classroom teachers and to support the students in mainstream settings. So it's about supporting and work with both our special education teachers and also our mainstream teachers. So that was some of the things that we could see when people wrote about what was happening in schools. Now, in tension with those drivers, there were also barriers that people wrote about. And one of these was resistance from the teaching community. Certainly, there's commentary around workload, around the need for skill development, the need for support for teachers, very strong, the need for more teachers. And so because of all of those issues, there's sort of a tension with teachers around being resistant to what's required to include all students in their classes. There's also commentary about lack of accountability. So, we have the philosophy, we have the intention, we have the expectations, but are schools being held accountable for their practices? And without that constant sort of review and reflection about how things are going, this can be a barrier to actual confident implementation of inclusive practices. And then finally, at the community level. So at this level, it was really clear that this came through in a lot of the literature around raised expectations of families, particularly. So that families, you can really feel, so another area of my work is looking at parents of students with disability in inclusive contexts. And so I see this all the time where families are learning more about inclusive education and their expectations are raising about what they want for their children. So parents are a very powerful driver for change. And so this, I think, was one of the very dynamic factors in moving towards closing of special schools. So parent advocacy, but also advocacy from other organisations. So no doubt organisations like Inclusive Education Canada. So not just through parents, but through organised advocacy, and also public campaigns were mentioned in some of the literature. So all of these were drivers for closing special schools. Now, on the other hand, the tension for this as a barrier, parents have a very strong force, and it's interesting, this tension between parental views, because parental choice has been named regularly as one of the barriers to closing of special schools, because there are parents who continue to want their children enrolled in special schools, and there are bureaucrats and teachers and policymakers who, in their rhetoric, highly value parental choice and want to keep options open for parents to choose the sort of school they want to go to. So that's a totally different discussion. Maybe we could get into that a little bit more, but certainly the notion of parental choice is a strong barrier to movements towards a unified system. So they're the 4 levels that we found, and a little bit about the dynamics that we found within each of those levels. So I have just one more slide here around that, because I had a bit of a think as well about whether there are any factors that seem to be common across all levels. So the first one, which you could probably guess because I've mentioned it a couple of times already, is the importance of leadership. So at all levels, societal, community, school, systemic level, in all of those levels, the importance of leaders who are committed to special school closure, who are committed to progress of inclusive education, who are grounded in social justice issues, who understand the marginalisation of people, who understand that for people to have better lives, so change needs to happen. All of that, those qualities in leaders are very important. So it's through those leaders that change is driven at all of those levels. So one of the questions that perhaps we can talk about a bit today, I think it is on the list to discuss, is how do we nurture these sorts of leaders? How do we support these leaders? How do we facilitate their work, because they're so important? The second factor I think that's important across all levels is the importance of attitudinal change. So it isn't just change in process. It's not just change in laws. It's not just change in structures. It's not just change in teaching strategy. It's the attitudes that underpin those changes. So for true inclusive progress to happen, for the to drive the belief in special school closure, we need to focus on attitudes as well, not just process. The third point that I think is really interesting and important and exciting in a way, because hopefully in the future we'll see this happening more and more, is innovation. We have to be innovative, because I think sometimes we get stuck in just thinking about what's happening in the here and now, in schools. And unless we think ahead of that and realize that what's going to happen in inclusive schools is potentially something that we don't even know about yet, unless we think that way, we're going to just keep doing the same things we've always done. So innovation, I think, has been a really key factor. How do we teach differently? What's the pedagogies we can use in our schools? How do we structure systems differently so that all students can be included? How do we work differently as parents? How do we work with schools differently than what we might have done in the past? So being innovative, I think, is really important. And finally, being proactive, not just reacting when things go wrong, not just reacting to when different policies and legislations come out potentially, but being proactive about making change that we see will make a difference. So I'll finish there and hand back over to you, Gordon. Is that
Sure, thank you.
right time?
Thank you for doing that. Perhaps you could stop sharing your screen. There we go. So let's go to our panel and let me introduce them to you. First of all, Kimberly Meach, who's a professor and researcher at Memorial University in Newfoundland. And Kimberly's currently partnering with IEC on a research project on special schools in Canada. We're glad she can join us. Krista Carr is Executive Vice President of Inclusion Canada and an advocate for inclusive education in her current and previous positions. And she's currently leading a national committee looking at actions that will address issues and obstacles experienced by families in our country. And finally, Diane Richler, who's joined us to add to the panel where Tim Lorman was unable to be with us. And we appreciate Diane stepping in at the last minute to do this. Diane chairs Inclusion International's Catalyst for Inclusive Education program. She's a former chair of the International Disability Alliance and a past president of Inclusion International. And she was the executive vice president of what's now Inclusion Canada for a number of years. So those are our three panelists, and I'm just going to let any one of them begin the discussion. Who's going to start?
Well, I'm happy to start if no one else is speaking up. And I'm sorry that I had trouble joining, so I missed your introductory comments, Gordon. And I don't know if you were able to say anything about the current status of the existence of segregated schools in Canada, or maybe if Kimberly is going to be able to add to that later. You know, I found it really interesting reading the article. It was a bit depressing to see how old some of the materials were, because I think that the question of closing special schools has not been such a big topic. So I think it's really good that you've raised that and you've flagged that as a real challenge, that, you know, the fact that people sort of assume, well, once everyone sees how great inclusion is, all the special schools are going to disappear. And clearly that has not happened. But I guess I had a couple of observations that maybe I could share, and maybe you know, all of you could react to, and we could hear more from the people who are part of this webinar. I guess the first comment is New Brunswick's a really small province, and the population of New Brunswick is smaller by many factors of the largest cities across the country. So I think that, you know, I remember Tom Skirdick's observation to Gordon about it being easier to make change in what he referred to, and it was his words, not mine, in terms of a primitive system, in terms of not having a well-entrenched segregated system. But I'm a bit concerned that reading the paper, one gets a sense of this great change in Canada. And I think there's been some, but I'm not sure that we have a good enough picture yet of how much change there's been. And I think we've seen already in the questions that have come up in the chat that for many families across the country, they don't see the positive change. I guess a couple of other points that I'll try to make quickly. One is whether you rated the drivers and barriers in terms of importance. I'm thinking particularly of the drivers. Did some have more impact than others, or is it more important to have certain drivers at certain levels rather than others in order to see change? Two other comments. One is that I thought that your observation about a federated system was interesting. And clearly there are negatives associated with having a federated system because change can happen in one place that's really great, but nobody else is affected by it. But on the other hand, the fact that we do have a federated system means that one province was able to really move forward and that was able to set an example for others. So, I think that there were pros and cons to that. And then my very last question is that I didn't think that you were very specific about special schools for whom. And so I inferred in the article that you were talking largely about learners with intellectual disabilities. But I wonder about whether the same drivers and barriers have existed for other learners with disabilities, say in terms of schools for students who are blind or students who are deaf or students who are deaf-blind. And I also wondered whether in the last few years there's also been a move to establish some special schools based on gender, based on race sometimes, based on other factors, and whether the move to specialized schools in some areas has either been a driver or a barrier in terms of learners with disabilities. So I'll stop there, and Gordon, you decide how to proceed from there.
Glenys, do you want to respond to one or more of Diane's points?
We didn't rate factors. We were just looking, we wanted to get sort of a broad overview of what we could see. And yes, definitely we take the point that it hasn't been consistent across Canada. And sort of like I said earlier, we saw that in a way as having value for our paper because it did allow us to also write about barriers rather than just, all the drivers. It was actually quite fortunate to have in a way that inconsistent implementation because we could look for that information there as well. So we didn't rate barriers. We just looked broadly for what we could see that authors wrote about when they were talking about closing special schools. Yes, we were thinking about students who have disability. And I realise, and that is an interesting point actually, Diane, how not only are special schools for students with disability increasing, well, they are in Australia, but yes, there are special segregated schools for other groups of students as well, and that seems to be increasing. I can't comment on that, but we were particularly thinking about disability because we were basing apart from some of the other comments I made in the paper and a bit earlier, we were basing our sort of reasoning for doing the investigation on general comment number 4 and that requirement to move away from a binary system. And so that usually pertinent to students with disabilities. So, and again, I'm not sure what it would be like in other countries, but here in Australia, having an intellectual disability is often the prerequisite for enrolment in a special school here. Although I do note that schools, that segregated schools are being set up for other students. So we have separate schools for students who have behaviour that's challenging teachers in regular schools. So it's not just intellectual disability, but it's certainly that was the focus for our paper. So I'm not sure if anybody else wants to jump in, or there was anything else specifically I could comment on.
Krista, Kimberly?
Well, I was just going to really was building off of some things that Diane said. And I think we have to think about as well, it's sort of like when we're doing deinstitutionalization initiatives, we have to be really careful that when we close the big ones, we aren't simply just moving people to the smaller ones. And if you look at that in the context of inclusive education, you have to also look at all the special segregated classes that exist in regular schools, right? The segregated wings, the segregated classes. And so when we're looking at a binary system, if I use your words, Glenys, I think it's really important to look at, like, there is closing the segregated schools and in fact at the moment keeping more of them from opening, because they are opening more of them in certain places in Canada, more so than others. But also looking at the segregated programs or classes that exist within regular schools and have for a long time, that our systems in our provinces like to call inclusion, which clearly we know would never meet the test of Article 24 or General Comment 4. So I think it's interesting, and I'd be interested in hearing about if you looked at any of that, or even if Kimberly has potentially done any looking at any of that. So that would be one. And the other thing, I guess so I live in New Brunswick, born and raised, and so I have a lot of experience with what happened in New Brunswick. And Diane is not wrong when she says we are, a subdivision of Toronto. Basically, if you look at our population. Having said that, we had a fairly well-developed segregated system when we moved to an inclusive system, and I think that so many of the things in your article resonated in terms of what had to happen or what had to be in place, not only to transition to an inclusive system, but even for an inclusive system to continue to work. And it's not perfect. In New Brunswick, we have our challenges, and we have to continue to work. But some of the things like political will, leadership, supporting teachers, I mean, all of it is pivotal and critical. I think it's just harder to do when you scale it. I think it's more complex and complicated when you look at the scale of it. And the only other thing I would want to mention is parental choice. So being an organization that supports families and works on behalf of families, and having myself done that for about 26 years now, when parents talk about wanting special classrooms, special programs, special schools for their kids, the first question we have to ask is why? And I think that's the thing we don't dig into enough. So we hear our politicians say, well, parents want this. This is what they want for their children. We're honoring what parents want. What parents want is for their children to have a good quality education, like everybody else gets to have. What parents want is that they know that when their kids go to school every day, they're going to be welcomed, they're going to be safe, they're going to, they're going to get education, and oftentimes they feel that can better be provided in a special or segregated or specialized environment. And I think that when parents get a chance to see and experience good quality inclusive education, not the kind that has their child walking the hallways all day or sitting at the back of the classroom turned around towards the wall, their views about inclusive education really, really change. Conversely, when they're in an inclusive system, and not getting good quality inclusion, and their child is actually not really included and not getting a good education, then they're saying, well, if this is the inclusive system, give me the segregated one. So I think the conversation really has to change to be about what are we doing to provide good quality inclusive education for all kids, and how do we ensure parents that that is what their child will receive in an inclusive system, regardless of their level of disability or whether or not they speak or don't speak or what exactly their needs might be. So I think that's it for me, Gordon.
Okay, Kimberly, jump in the conversation.
Well, I can't say anything about New Brunswick because the very first presentation I ever did about inclusive education when I was a student, I got in trouble for calling New Brunswick and Newfoundland and Labrador neighboring provinces. I still think about that, and I feel like they are, but I wasn't wrong, even though there's that big ocean chunk in between still. And I've certainly, throughout my career, New Brunswick's practices have certainly been held up as examples of inclusive education, but inclusive education isn't perfect. None of our practices are perfect. There seems to be always a segment of students who don't seem to quite fit in inclusive education. And when I say that, I mean that the inclusive education isn't a good fit for them. So unlike some of my colleagues, I'm not 100% certain that every child will be able to fit in inclusive classrooms. I certainly raised one of them, who the school system would have been quite delighted for me to have homeschooled, which I refused to do. But if what for him, if it wasn't for a little bit of education in a one-on-one setting, not in a segregated school, a segregated classroom, he never would have gone to school. So I always have those things in the back of my mind, but there's so much good research saying that inclusion works. And while I haven't crunched all the numbers for our data set of what's happening in Canada in terms of segregated settings, there certainly are many examples of segregated schools and segregated classrooms across our country, certainly that do persist. I was reading an article last night about what we're doing in the Canadian context, because one of the things I think about is how do we deal with the disability and mental health from all perspectives, and how well do we support that in our inclusive classrooms. So there's lots of that evidence saying that this particular article, the author's last name is Anaby, from 2017, and they talk about that there are lots of good things happening in the literature around health, well-being, those types of broad constructs for students who have disabilities, or disabled students, depending if you prefer person first or identity first language. But there are still persisting difficulties with academic outcomes, and then that participation piece can be a problem as well. So we always have to think about, when we're making a plan, is how do we move beyond physical inclusion to that social inclusion too. Every day as a psychologist, I hear stories from parents about their children being marginalized, disabilities or not. So we can put everybody in the same place. How do we make it happen that we support one another? Certainly throughout those really tough preteen adolescent years as well, that can cause all sorts of ongoing issues, even in inclusive environments. So there are different ways that we can exclude. We can exclude as a whole school, we can exclude as a classroom, we can exclude socially too. So all those different layers have to be worked on. And then how do we support mental health and all of that? I feel like we're still at our infancy when it comes to how are we going to do that school-based mental health programs. And even if you read the literature, I was reading one from 2020 about Canadian services again the other day, and that particular program was put in place to support mental health programs, and for typically developing students or non-disabled students, as well as students with disabilities. And that was certainly said, hey, this is one of the first ones out there that we're looking at. So we have to go all the way back to what are we doing in our teacher education programs. I mean, it wasn't very long ago that courses around special education in Ontario became mandatory for our teacher education program. So I think we have to go back to those roots and see how we can give more education to our teachers and more tools for them too, to support our really diverse classroom environments. But I think we're doing many good things. I don't know if that answered any of anybody's questions, but it was kind of my flow of comments.
Thanks, Kimberly. Glenys, I'm curious about your thoughts on funding, because I've always maintained that my experience was that if you don't use the funding that's being provided to fully support inclusion, then if you're in fact using substantial proportion of your funding to support segregated education, then you're not going to be able to support the inclusion program effectively. And I think in many cases, in the cities and communities in Canada where inclusion has not gone very far, one of the problems is that the substantial amount of the money is still being spent on special classes and special schools. And the available support to the classroom teacher here, there, this school, that school, when these efforts to make inclusion happen on an individual basis, and maybe there are many of these cases, but if the systemic supports with the money moving from one system into the other doesn't happen, it's not going to be well supported. And I think the results are not going to be good. And parents and teachers alike will conclude that this really isn't a very good model. So to me, it's a fundamental, like I have always felt that most school systems in Canada are already spending enough money on special education in the traditional sense. But if they redeploy it and move those resources into supporting classroom teachers in inclusive settings, they can make inclusion work. Not perfectly, not all the time for everybody, and with no exceptions, but for 99.5% of the kids almost all the time. But the funding has to be moved. And in many school districts in Canada, that has not happened. 80–90% of the money is still spent on special teachers in special environments. And the kids who are included are dependent entirely on their classroom teacher. And if it's warranted, maybe an educational assistant. And that doesn't cut it. It simply doesn't bring about the kind of change that's needed to deliver quality inclusive education. Any thoughts on that?
So what you've just described certainly aligns with what we read, that when there was that movement towards special school closure, there was definitely action thought towards redeploying funding away from supporting special schools into supporting students in regular schools. So I would absolutely agree with what you're talking about. I mean, for a lot of years, various colleagues, friends of mine have looked at the numbers, how much is actually spent on special schools and spent on building new special schools. As Krista was saying, you know, if we could stop the building of new special schools at least as one step, then the funding that goes into those schools, and just as a tangent, and is often very proudly advertised by governments. So there's a lot of media here when a new special school is open, and proudly, you know, sort of announcing all of the resourcing that goes into it. So yes, there's a lot of resourcing that does go into there, and one would wonder, you know, if that, and again, that's part of the tension, I think, is that, and I've read about this for years, that there's so much that's bound up in the special education system, that approach. There's all the teacher training, there's all of the money, the building, the infrastructure. There's so much that's bound up in it. To actually disassemble that, I think people probably look at it and think, well, that's just too hard. How do we do it? So we're leaning into that, I think, is part of the the dynamics around how we would change it is to just saying, yes, this is going to be hard. How do we redeploy all of that funding so that it actually supports, you know, a unified system? I also want to add there too, because my background is in teaching and I used to work with teachers a lot before I moved to university. And I just want to sort of be careful in a way too and say that even though, so don't get me wrong, funding and support is essential, but sometimes I don't think money is always the answer. And I think when we rely on money, there's never enough. If we think that money is the answer to all of this, we'll never find enough. So I think we also have to think, while we think about the redeployment of resources, we also have to really put the same effort into how do we build capacity, because, you know, you can have all the money. I worked with schools that were funded extensively and still were not including students well. So I don't think money is the answer. It helps, but it's not the only thing that's important in this change, I don't think.
I would just jump in there and say I couldn't agree with you more. I know my experience in New Brunswick was, you know, we would have you'd have a school on one street in a community that was doing an amazing, like over the top job with inclusive education, and it, you know, 3 streets over, similar school, same number if you want to get right down to the of educational assistance, and the same number, you know, and all of the things that was really struggling with it, right? And it came down very often to, you know, there was no more resources in one place than there was in the other. The students weren't vastly different. What came down to, it came down to leadership. It came down to the support teachers got from their teams in their schools. What were the, you know, what were the structures that existed within the school to ensure that teachers could get support from other teachers? How were resource teachers being utilized in terms of supporting teachers as opposed to just supporting kids one-on-one in small groups? You know, just so many of those factors, and whether or not they believed it was the right thing to do. I you know, you mentioned that in your research, and it really does. Now, they need a lot more. You know, believing it's the right thing to do is not the only thing that makes it work, for sure, but it definitely is a pretty fundamental underpinning when your starting point as an educator is all these kids are mine and I have a responsibility for all of them, and I'm going to do the best I can with all of them. So, but lots more is required to support teachers to be successful with all kids as well.
Gordon, can I jump in with another question?
Of course.
Just wondering about whether the perceived degree of disability, like, was something that came up in the research. I mean, are segregated schools being kept open for students who are identified as having more complex needs? Are they being kept open for students based on a label, based on a diagnosis? Do you have any sense of, you know, whether kids with less complex needs are being more included? What does the research tell you?
So that wasn't a feature that comes to mind as being in what we read as being a big factor, but it certainly has, Diane, come out after the paper was published and other papers that we've published in this area. In fact, nearly every conversation I've had with people about the idea of closing special schools. So it sort of just always surprises me why, you know, how resistant people are to this idea, because to me it seems like a logical next step. However, yes, that's an issue that's raised, and rightly so. Like, I think it should be raised. There are students that we can't necessarily imagine at this point what schools might look like that are established in order to, you know, include. So there are some students that I know that we really need to use our creativity and our innovation in order to include. So that definitely is something that people raise a lot. I think part of this is, and it probably brings me to a point that I wanted to make after you were talking, Krista, is that we mix up an inclusive school with what's happening in schools now. So I think people resist inclusion, but they're not actually, it's not inclusion they're resisting being physically present without the adjustments and the support that's required in order to do well. And I think we get stuck with that too, Diane. I'm interested to think what you think, because I think we get stuck in that when we talk about those kids, you know, the what about kids. And when we start to talk about them, all we can think of is what we see in schools now, what's existing now. And we don't even know what's possible. I think part of this is innovation and vision and leaning into that challenge. I mean, we have a lot of expertise from specialists. We have a lot of, I think, more and more expertise from in mainstream schools. How do we work towards transforming schools so that it's not just a matter of the best of both worlds? I don't think. I think it's transformation to something different. What would schools look like? I mean, what a conversation to have. And in fact, we at QUT, I think our plan is to have a conversation about that in a forum later down the track around what would it look like if we had schools that actually were modeled to include all students. What would that take? What would we need in those schools? So transforming schools in order to include all students. So those complex students with complex learning profiles as well. So I'd be interested to hear what other people think about that, actually, because I personally believe that's what inclusion is about. It's all students. And until we think all students, then it's a barrier. We have to imagine more. We have to imagine that schools will be something better, because we know that segregation harms people, and we know that segregated lives begin in segregated schools. There's sort of no doubt about any of that, but we just resist taking on that move towards progressing that. And what do we have to do in order to do that?
Yeah, I think it's really, really clear. I mean, there's been research paper after research paper after research paper. I mean, the research is very clear about outcomes from a good and quality inclusive education are way better. And again, agree 100%. Inclusive schools are not inclusive if they only do a good job with one group of kids. It has to be every kid that walks through the door. And that's why good quality inclusive education is really about, it affects everybody. It's really about everybody. It's about every child getting what they need, whether they're the high achieving, quote unquote, bright student, or they're a child that needs a little bit more. But good quality inclusive schools respond really, really well to all children, regardless of how they present, what their home situations are, what their gender identities or other factors might be. It's just that often there are schools who do good with all of the other kids and not so good with ours, or don't want to include the ones we're talking about. So I think we do have to broaden the conversation. We need to be talking about the fact that inclusive schools are about all kids, and that's what makes them good for all children, not just good for kids with disabilities. So I think, and we talk about, we know, and as you mentioned, Glenys, the research shows that kids who are excluded in school are far more likely to be excluded in life after school. Kids who are well included in school, their outcomes in life are far more inclusive, are far more robust and different. So we know all this, like we know all of it. We have all the data, we have all the research, we have all the things. And it's always still so perplexing about why we keep building new segregated schools or creating more segregated classrooms or programs and not putting our effort, energy, and money into making all schools quality, inclusive schools for all children.
Okay, our time is running down. One of the observations I've heard Diane share over the years is that if a school wants to call itself an excellent school and it's not inclusive, then it's a sham. Like if a school is a really good school, it should be able to support all the learners who would naturally attend that school. And I think that connects to something that I felt for quite a while, which is that one of the challenges we face is getting school leaders to understand that making inclusion work in their school is a really strong way to make their school a better school. That school improvement, enhancing every practice that helps inclusion work will make their school a better school for every child. So I think those are some thoughts I have as we wind up. Glenys, do you want to make a final statement? I think most of our participants are from Canada. There are a number from registered from other places, but just give us maybe a few summary thoughts on inclusion in Canada and how it has provided any kind of insights for you in your effort to make Australian schools inclusive.
Reading through the literature in Canada has given a clear picture to me and our team of the tension, as I think Diane or Krista, someone was saying before, of the tensions that we have to lean into. I think there's some clear evidence that it's possible, not perfect. And on another one of your webinars, someone said direction, not perfection. And as long as we keep heading in the direction, I think it's, that's such an important thing. So it's given us a clear picture of the tensions that must be leaned into if we are to make this, if we're to keep progressing inclusive education. And I believe that we won't keep progressing inclusive education until we close special schools. So having some insights into closing special schools will help us in this movement towards making our mainstream, to developing, transforming into inclusive schools. So we can't avoid the question of closing special schools any longer, I don't believe. But thank you very much for
add to that. I would add to that, that applies to special classes as well. As long as we have special places that teachers can feel it's appropriate to send some students, then the only question is which students go and which ones do not. And if that's the kind of thinking that dominates in our schools, there will always be a reason to send some. And we have to end that in order to really make our schools inclusive. I want to thank all of you. I want to especially thank Glenys for joining us from, you say, sunny Brisbane and most of Canada. It may be sunny, but it's not warm. And I want to thank our panelists, Diane Richler, Kimberly Meach, Krista Carr, and I want to thank everybody who's tuned in and taken part as a participant. We do see your comments, and I remind you that Glenys's article and the recording of this session will be placed on our Inclusive Education Canada website if people want to check it out there. Thank you so much, and over and out. Talk next time. Bye-bye.